The Spinoff Podcast Network.
K-pop to me means more than just listening to music. It's learning to be myself.
The Spinoff's new documentary, K-Pollies, follows 3 Pacific youth obsessed with K-pop. In a one-off documentary, see what they've found in Korean pop culture and how they bridge it with their own.
When you start dressing, looking different, everyone side-eyes you. But in K-pop, they're just like, no, like celebrate yourself.
Watch K-Pollies today at thespinoff.co.nz/videos. Made with the support of New Zealand On Air. You're listening to Business is Boring, a podcast that reckons it's anything but. Business is Boring is brought to you by Spark Lab, offering inspiration and practical advice to help businesses find their edge. To hear more about Spark Lab, including details about the latest events, workshops and business tools, visit sparklab.co.nz. And now, here's your host, Simon Pound.
You're listening to Business is Boring, a podcast that reckons it's anything but. Business is Boring is made by the Spinoff with help from Callaghan Innovation, New Zealand's innovation agency. Here's your host, Simon Pound.
No one needs to be told mental health is at a crisis point in this country. And while there is welcome news of $1.9 billion of new funding in the latest budget, right now, services are stretched. Finding the right care at the right time is a challenge. Knowing how to navigate the system is a challenge. Even knowing when to reach out for help and where to do that is hard. The whole system itself is set up on a reactive model, but as with all health and fitness, preventative and proactive is better than reactive. So how do we do this with mental health care? Well, questions like these and more have led to today's guest starting a new venture, creating an AI chatbot that helps to mimic a GP consult, but creating an atmosphere and feeling of a chat with a knowledgeable friend. It helps to increase people's comfort in sharing information and sends people to the right places for the assistance they need next. It's called Clearhead. It's in market now and making a difference from the get-go. To chat the journey, the need and what's next, co-founder, CEO and doctor Angela Lim joins us now. Kia ora. Thank you for joining us.
Kia ora.
Hey, so tell me first up, you trained long and hard to become a doctor in paediatrics. What was the kind of drive to go from being a doctor to becoming an entrepreneur and making a difference in this space?
Yeah, there's nothing quite like the relationship you have with your patients. It's very special. But it also became frustrating when you felt that you were constantly the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. And what you're doing is have patients come in when they're unwell. They're well enough to kind of be sent home, but we never give them the tools to stay well. And then we get surprised when they come back in. And so increasingly, I started to see that the system as a whole was not set up to enable patients' well-being, which meant that there was a real missed opportunity to use technology to help with that process.
And while you were working as a doctor, this isn't your first venture, is it? Like you've been on the entrepreneurial path for quite a while.
Yeah, this is my second startup. My first startup, I did it while I was in my final year of medical school. It was really to try and solve this problem where you had people on the front line really understanding the problem, having really great ideas, but their ideas don't often filter up to the top of the decision-making process where people get funded to try these out as projects. And so what we wanted to do was to be able to have an innovation pipeline in the hospitals where there are thousands of people to make sure that people democratically is able to pick what are the great ideas and what will get funded.
Because there must be so many smart people seeing the same problems over and over and then, creating that pipeline to get the idea out is such a great idea.
Yeah, unfortunately, management didn't buy it, which I think, again, reflects the particular problem that it was trying to solve, which is that healthcare is quite interesting in that there is almost an antagonistic relationship between those who provide the care and those who are managing the system. And so this disconnect makes people feel that their ideas or their opinions don't matter. And I think the fact that not putting a system like this in place is a reflection of the current status quo.
Right, but not to be kind of knocked down by the status quo. You're starting again with Clearhead. You started again with Clearhead. What was the kind of founding insight that made you decide to start an AI chatbot?
It was actually to prove that it is possible that in healthcare we can work with emerging technology and not still be using fax machines and pages from the 1960s that I still do when I was working last year, and be able to do it in a timely manner and to not cost the system too much money. And I had oversight of that because I sat on multiple governance boards for health IT projects that were being rolled out nationally. There was one called the Shared Care Plan, which was around, can you create a platform where all your different providers can be on the same page around managing your care for someone with chronic and multiple comorbidities?
Because there is a remarkable situation at the moment, isn't there, where the individual needing care sees so many different providers at so many different stages of the process, yet all of that information isn't shared and isn't centrally known necessarily.
Yeah, and I think part of that is not even having the infrastructure to do that. So, for example, if you see your GP, they have their own patient management system, so their electronic health record is separate from the ones that you see from the hospital. And often, because of that lack of communication, it meant that in some cases, patient harm occurs.
And I imagine that when you have something that has such stigma outside, but also such a hard thing for people personally grappling with things like mental health and depression, that when there is a difficulty or a barrier in seeking help, that must make it harder again.
Yeah, and we know that because of that stigma, most people are not seeking help. But even if those who have finally got to the point where they do want to seek help, they have challenges being able to get the help that they need. And it always breaks my heart when you hear stuff like GPs telling you that they would have patients confiding to them that I'm feeling like I want to kill myself right now. And they feel that they are not able to make the appropriate referrals because they know they would just be rejected.
And I imagine that the process, like a GP, although obviously a really important person in a patient's life, maybe booking an appointment at some time in the future and then having to go to a clinic and sit in a waiting room to talk to someone isn't the most reactive, at the moment, possible solution to someone needing help with such a situation.
Yeah, and again, it's actually an example of healthcare being able to really come into the 21st century. Why is it that there are so many things that we are used to in our day-to-day lives, for example, with Uber, with our online banking, we are able to do what we need to get done at the time in which we want to get them done. And healthcare is very much about the power sitting with the provider. And so you get told when you're going to be seen. And it might be at a time that's inconvenient for you. So it might be at a time, if you think about it, for someone needing to organize multiple childcare arrangements. It might be at a time where it's just before you're going to do a very important presentation at work. So you know your schedule best. Why is it that you're not able to ensure that that is a part of the process in which you decide when you get to seek the care that is important to you?
And there are very real capacity issues at the moment, aren't there? It's not that the system, has heaps of latency that people aren't accessing. Like there's a lot of, wonderful caring professionals working as hard as they can at an absolute limit, aren't there?
Oh, absolutely. The only reason our health system as a whole is still functioning is because you get the surgeons who come in the weekend when they're not actually scheduled to work to meet our targets that have been set by the government. It is the capacity of the sector to almost exploit the goodwill of practitioners who really, we live by our oath of doing good and doing no harm. And so if you look at mental health specifically, 97% of the budget currently goes to 3% of the population that needs it. So what happens to the other 97% that needs it? I think that is something that we really need to ask ourselves seriously. How are we going to achieve that? And you mentioned, for example, the well-being budget and the 1.9 billion that is being invested into mental health over the next 4 years. The government should be applauded for very clearly signaling that this is an important priority. But the challenge will be around how that is implemented. So, for example, even with majority of this funding going into delivery of care, their target is that they want to have 375,000 more people be able to access mental health care in your primary care setting. If you know the statistics of 1 in every 2 New Zealander will face some sort of mental health challenge in their lifetime, we're looking at 2.5 million people at some point in their life needing care. And so when you talk about 375,000 people, it just doesn't cut the mustard. And so we need to be bold enough to say, okay, we have been needing to invest in things that are more scalable, that are more cost-effective, and I think that technology such as ours, using artificial intelligence, allows that to happen.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about how Clearhead works, and what would an experience be for a user if they accessed it?
So we came from the perspective of trying to understand that most people might be having something niggling in the background that they don't know if it's normal, or are they going crazy? And because of the stigma of mental health, they don't really want to be asking their friends or family, when was the last time you can remember a friend sitting you down and saying, hey, I think I have depression, or it's very rare that happens. And most people are currently just using Dr. Google, which is not the best place to find information, especially when we know we don't have a very digitally literate population. So what we tried to do was say, can we do better than Dr. Google? And what we developed was a platform that basically guides you towards helping you figure out what your problem is and what help exists for you to access and what tools can you use to stay well. So really, we're New Zealand's first AI-driven diagnostic and triage tool for mental health. And so how it works is you come onto the site and you say, and you chat with our chatbot. It's kind of like texting someone. And the chatbot asks you a series of questions that mimics a GP's consult. If the GP had all the time to sit down with you and let you go through this set of questions. And then at the end of it, it provides you with a summary that you can then show your GP so that your GP immediately understands what is it that you're going through, how bad is it, and how is it affecting your life. And then from there, you can immediately take what normally takes 45 minutes to get through that whole process. The patient is doing it in their own time, in the privacy of their home, where we know the research shows they're more likely to openly disclose what they're going through more truthfully, and then be able to kind of find you the help immediately. So instead of spending the first consult going, what's the challenge? It goes, let's refine what I understand your problem is, and then immediately start with getting you the help that you need. So that's one thing we do. The other thing that is quite hard to do is find therapy. And so what we've done is we've built basically Airbnb, but for therapists. And the reason we did that was because we know we have the highest youth suicide rates in the world. In fact, the second next highest suicide rate is 8 times less than us. That's the scale in which we're not dealing with this problem in our country for the last 10 years. And so how do you engage young people? You go to where they are. They are much more, even the ones that are really unwell, you'll see them on their phone. And also, you want to use tools in which they're familiar with. So they're familiar with Airbnb, so they're more likely to search for something similar to that style and book online. Because you try to call a young person on the phone today, they're not going to pick up their phone. And then finally, can you give people tools to understand themselves better? So it's not that you don't know that you need to go for a run once a week because that makes you feel better. But do you have a system where it reminds you and you can track your progress to build that self-awareness for yourself? So really, we try to have a very holistic system in understanding how people would go through the care journey, and can we do it in a really supportive manner? And through using technology, it's available when you want it and not when it's the 9 to 5 where people are working.
How are you getting this in front of people? Like, how are people adopting it and interacting with it?
Yeah, doing podcasts like this helps. So Clearhead is free to use, so please download it and share it with anyone that you feel would find it helpful. But one of the things we did was to really live by our values. And our values was one, to be collaborative. And so actually this whole thing was co-designed with mental health users. The chatbot was co-designed with psychiatrists and GPs to have that clinical validity. Our second value was manakitanga, which is really around that guided caring process. And that's why our chatbot does that for you. And that sort of that authenticity and transparency allows us to kind of share with you our journey since we started in September. And so one of the ways we've built through word of mouth is through our social media channels. But that only gets you to a certain point. So where we are at now in our partnership journey is we're working through PHOs. PHOs are the organizing bodies for all the thousands of GPs in the country. There are 32 of them in this country, 32 PHOs. So last week, for example, we had a meeting with 7 of the PHOs, and 6 of them have already come back to me around wanting to have further discussion around how will they get this out to the people that need it. As I'm sure you know, product market fit is everything.
Yeah, I imagine that you must have, the challenges that most apps have with building awareness, with the extra challenge of people aren't exactly going to, in droves, jump on Facebook and say, I'm using this and I'm loving it, because of that overwhelming difficulty in talking about mental health. And I wonder, that idea of mental health being like a sprain, where everyone sprains themselves sometimes and then you bounce back, rather than mental health being, as it's treated now, like some kind of constant that then settles. How do apps like this actually help to evolve the conversation into looking at mental health issues in the context of people's wider lives?
Yeah, I think that these conversations are being had at the moment. So what you do see is, and I have a lot of people tell me these, is that other people will ask them, I want to see a therapist. Who did you see? And seeing a therapist is a very individual process. So you might have depression, but the reasons in which you have depressions can be very varied. It could be because you're being burned out at work. It could be because you're being bullied at school. It could be because you've lost your partner. There's a whole host of reasons, and you want to see someone that is actually appropriate for what you're going through. And so what we've delivered basically is a platform that a support person, like a friend or family, can say, okay, well, I saw this person, but I'm not sure if they might be right for you. Why don't you go onto Clearhead and you can use the system to help you figure out exactly what your challenge is and find you the right help that's specific to it. Because at the moment, we don't do that personalization. Even when you see a GP, for example, because of the 15-minute time constraint, they very rarely sit down and ask you, how is it that you want to receive your information? Do you like to watch videos? Do you like to read books? So those are the questions that we ask so that we can provide help to you in a way that you would actually be receptive to receiving and therefore improve your health literacy.
At what stage should people be interacting with the app?
We believe that it's best suited for those in the mild to moderate end of the spectrum, not people who are currently going through crisis. When you're at that stage, really you need much more wraparound intensive care that only a human can deliver. But even if all you feel is like, I'm not as productive at work as I like to be, sometimes it is, again, that lack of self-awareness that tools like ours can help.
And when people do interact with the app, when you say that there are multiple ways that people can then progress, so they might be given information, or they might be able to access kind of the marketplace for the most appropriate person to speak to next. How do you go about creating the kind of information and those journeys for people? Like, how do you vet what information people should see and kind of keep up with them on the journey?
They completely are able to decide that process. So they decide what information they want to disclose, what information they want to see, and then they are able to save all those settings and whatever recommendations that we provide them. So everything really is in your own hands, and I think that's fundamentally what we wanted to do. We wanted to provide the consumer the control. We want to make sure that we do it in a manner that's convenient for them and provide them with a whole lot of choice that's actually available. For example, on our database, we took 6 months basically to curate what is evidence-based that works out there in terms of mental health. And we have more than 600 plus resources on our site. If you ask any practitioner, for example, they might have a couple of things that they have off the top of their head. They're not going to have 600 things off the top of their head. And so that's the role where technology can really supplement or augment the experience that you have with a human person.
And how does this help with like the geographic spread of people and the fact so few people have the same GP across their lifetime now, and so many people move and so many people are, distant from the care they need?
Yeah. So the challenge of ensuring that equity in healthcare outcomes is really prominent in areas like the regions, especially those that are slightly more rural. And that's just because the investment just isn't allocated as much as, say, your urban centers like Auckland. And also they have unique challenges, like the closest therapist might be 50 kilometers away. So what a site like ours does is allow you to first search, for example, for who are the therapists available that delivers online therapy. And also the other thing when you think about with these communities is, the same person that you're going to see on as a therapist might be the same person that on Friday you're going to have drinks with over a barbecue. And then it gets awkward. And if you take the angle from, for example, Maori, they don't want people to talk about their business. It's a different layer of that stigma question. And so it gives people who don't otherwise have choice in their communities to look for those outside of those communities to get the help that they need. And therefore, they're more likely to seek help. So that's how we think we will be able to help the regions.
And how are you going with getting the word out and getting users and how are things going with the progress?
It's going much better than expected. We had 100 users sign up in the first 24 hours. We actually haven't done any real marketing spend. And in the first month, we had 1,500 unique visitors. But again, it is about making sure that we're getting the right people accessing our site. And that's why we are working together with the PHOs. And through that, for example, if I can get those 7 PHOs on board, that's a coverage of 1.6 million people just in Auckland. So getting the word out through that is a slow process, and I think one that I constantly have to remind myself. But I think we've made sufficient traction to know that we're meeting a need.
And it must take so much development ahead of actually getting it out and about. Like, how have you gone about kind of building the team and accessing the funding and building the infrastructure to make sure that it is clinically valid and also will win the trust of these medical professionals?
It was hard. Talent is surprisingly hard to find. But we're very lucky. We have a very talented team, which is why we were able to build the platform within 6 months. Any organization trying to do something similar would have taken 5 times as long and probably 10 times as expensive. Because essentially the team is me as the non-technical clinical person, and then I have a back-end developer who's my co-founder, a front-end developer, and a mobile app developer, and that's it. And then we kind of have been working with the clinicians on their own time, so that's usually me being the person liaising that. So setting up the team was probably one of the hardest thing we had to do, getting it right. And then really, I think because people really understand that this is an important cause, they're more than happy to help. And so that's how we've been able to kind of get some interest to work with us.
And you have a really long history of involvement with governance across a whole bunch of organisations, which is so cool to see. Like, what's got you interested in the first instance? Because right through medical school and the like, taking really key roles in things like the board of the YWCA, and then working currently as the chair, right through currently to be the chair of Trust 2020, which is amazing.
Yeah, I think that I never quite felt that I fitted in medical school. So governance was something I fell into during my search to understand what is it that I could be good at and how can I contribute better to a society that I felt I could really make an impact on. So the YWCA was one of the earliest boards I sat on, and then really just getting a real bug for it, basically, seeing how you can contribute at a strategic level around how resources are being allocated to actually achieve the goals in which we've set ourselves to. And I think because of my background, being someone who was a migrant and a medical doctor, you don't really get doctors on boards, really brought a flavor and a way of seeing the world that people don't anticipate some of the questions that I ask. So I think that being able to really feel that tangibly you've made a difference in how the organization achieves its aim was something that I felt I wanted to keep doing.
And what's kind of being involved in those things? How has that helped you build what you're doing? As I imagine you've seen a lot of leadership styles and a lot of different kind of leaders and have a great network of those people. And has that helped build out what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that entrepreneurship is so glorified today, and you talk to most young people before they even graduated from university, and everybody's like, I want to be an entrepreneur. And I think people seriously underestimate how hard this is. Even with the traction that we have, there are times where me and my co-founder would have really deep and long talks about, are we on the right track? Are we doing the right things? Should we keep going? And the last 10 years have been about gaining the experience to understand what it's like to lead a team. And I learned very quickly that actually open communication and making people not feel that there is a hierarchy, that everybody is part of the same mission, builds a really strong culture in which everybody takes responsibility for what they set out to do, which is again around the ownership that allowed us to achieve the goals that we set which was pretty ambitious to start with. Networks are crucial. One of the two key problems we wanted to solve with Clearhead was the accessibility to care issue, which we've talked about already, but also the fragmentation of care. And so it kind of defeats the purpose if something like Clearhead isn't nationally rolled out as this one-stop shop where you can trust the system. So quite early on, we were having conversation with the ministry around, what would it look like to kind of get the evidence needed to have Clearhead rolled out nationally and supported by the ministry. And sort of the direction that was then given to us was that actually we need to go and engage with the 32 PHOs and the 20 DHBs because that's where the money is. And most startup founders will not have those networks. And I spent the last 10 years curating and developing those networks that allowed me the first door to open, which then opened the next door. And so very clearly it's around if you want to run your own business, you need to take time to do little projects like what I did around building those skills to lead a team and building your networks.
And how about with governance? Because being able to contribute in that way and bring new perspectives to, I'm sure, a lot of the organisations that you've worked with. What advice would you have for people who maybe do care about how things run and do have strategic and leadership and experience and insights to bring? Should they know that the door is open and what should they do?
Yeah, I think that people think that sitting on boards is something that you do after you retire, and there is this archetype of what a board member looks like. And actually, I think the first thing to start off is ask yourself the question of why you're doing this. If you're doing this to prep up your own ego, then probably not a good idea. But if you are doing it for the right reason, then you'll start by searching for organizations that the causes align with what you want to make an impact on, align with the values that you have, and then keep your eye out on opportunities because almost all organizations, not-for-profit, corporates, etc., will have boards, and those opportunities will come up randomly. So it's definitely about just throwing your hat in the ring. You never really know what they're looking for. They might be looking for that young person view. They might be looking for that Maori Pacifica lens. So their diversity is crucial in allowing us to be able to navigate this increasingly complex world. So just put your hands, just throw your hat in the ring would be what I would suggest.
And I mean, you've worked extraordinarily hard over a number of areas and made a contribution in these things already. And it's been really cool to see you have been recognised in things like, lists of 30 people under 30 to watch and 40 people under 40 to watch and the like, and, some of the top alumni of the institutions that you've been to and the like. Like having had this kind of great kind of CV to kick off with, how do you define success and kind of what are you shooting for?
Yeah, I think those lists are really arbitrary, and I often feel a strong sense of imposter syndrome when I get on them because I know so many amazing people who are doing really cool things that, for whatever reason, don't happen to be on those lists. But I do think that success for me is just being able to make a difference in my community. I feel very privileged that I've had the opportunities that I do. And everything I do has been about living to my values, which is about fairness and equality, and being able to give back to New Zealand as a country who has given me so much. So success for me, really, for the company, we have global ambitions. We would love to be that trusted global consumer healthcare brand that and that we know we're financially sustainable and touching millions of lives. But, for me as a person, if I can continue to make sure that one person is able to get the help early enough that prevents an unnecessary loss, that's success enough for me.
Oh, wonderful. Well, thank you for coming and sharing your story today. That's Dr. Angela Lim, the co-founder and CEO of Clearhead. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to Simon Day for producing, and thank you very much for having us along in your ears. Cheers.
You've been listening to Business is Boring, presented by Simon Pound. And brought to you by the Spinoff and Callaghan Innovation.
From the Spinoff Podcast Network, that was Business is Boring, brought to you by SparkLab. Make sure you're following Business is Boring wherever you get your podcasts. And for more information on SparkLab, visit sparklab.co.nz. Ready to rediscover the joys of cycling? With over 300 kilometres of cycle paths across Tāmaki Makaurau, jumping on your bike and going for a ride is such a fun way to discover the city from a different perspective. Cycling is getting more and more popular across Auckland, so now's a great time to join the hype and give cycling a go. Head to at.govt/cycling to find your nearest cycleway today. The Spinoff Podcast Network.